Next time we should do it live.
What's that?
I said
Next time we
next
should
time
do
we should
live?
do it live.
Yeah, no, I actually have been thinking about like figuring out a way to do it because I've noticed shows that do, and when questions come in, they can like display them on screen, and it just I feel like makes it so much more of a interactive process. But
Yeah.
anyways, Shaleen, welcome back to the Cole Memo. How's it going?
Good. Thank you for having me. I think this might be the first time I've been on this show that I haven't been like promoting anything and like hyper trying to explain something. I'm like much calmer than usual, so that's nice.
Well, that's cool. That's cool. I'm gonna display it on my screen right now, but can you remind my listeners who you are and where they can find some of your work online?
Sure. Yeah, this is Parabola Center. This is a nonprofit organization that I run. It's a think tank that focuses on racial justice and preventing monopolies, or to put it more concisely, putting people over corporations. So you can find all of our resources for free online. And my background is I've been working in legalization since the early 2000s, since I was a student. And I have worked on campaigns, mostly some of the first legalization campaigns, and then practiced business law. And then I was appointed as a regulator. And then after that term ended, I started Parabola Center. So about 20 years now in drug policy.
Yeah. And for people that are tuning in right now, in case you don't know, I'm from Illinois, and one of the things we did recently, Shalene, was revisited some of your early days in cannabis activism, Hash Wednesday at the University of Illinois, which people can read about and see pictures of you and other activists and the interviews we did at colememo.com/history. Just so you know, and I know I think I briefly mentioned to you this to you before we went on air, but I was contacted by students at the University of Illinois at a cannabis club that exists. And apparently this year Hash Wednesday came back, and it's
Oh
thanks
my
to
God.
what we did with that series.
Wow. Inspired by your work. That's
Yeah.
so cool. That's
In
so
fact,
cool.
they took one of the old flyers that I had archived and just marked out like 1986 or whatever the year was, and then just put 2024.
Oh my God, I love that.
Yeah.
I never would have seen that. At the time, it felt like that's what we were doing because we knew that it started in the 70s and it felt like we were creating it for the modern age. And now that process repeats. That's amazing.
Yeah, it just made me really happy to hear it and to hear that, it's while it is a moment to sit back and enjoy with your fellow students, it sounded like they had a very robust conversation about what still needs to be done with regard to drug policy in Illinois and across the world. So
Wow.
very reassuring to hear that in some ways we're able to radicalize the youth. I've been saying that with my
Yeah.
I've been on a little tour with my mini documentary going to different schools. I went to the University of Illinois, Southern Illinois University, some community colleges, Illinois State University, and I've been saying we're radicalizing the youth. Um,
It was really good, by the way. I had only seen the early version, which I told you I thought it was great, the early version, but I just saw the final one recently. It was really, really good.
Thank you, thank you. And when I created it, I thought a lot about people like yourself, Representative Ammons, and everybody else that was in the fight, leading up to this. And that really is the foundation of what that mini documentary is supposed to be. It's like what we thought legalization would be and then what it actually was. And yeah, yes, thank you for checking it out and thank you for those kind words on the project.
I thought it was really persuasive. I thought it was really like fast paced, interesting, everything documented so well. And then I don't know if I had seen something similar that really covered the corporate capture issue so thoroughly, at least not in a way that was so extensively documented, like every second of it. I really appreciated that. Are you going to show it in more universities, you think?
Yeah, actually, I have an invite next month in a university in Chicago. Unfortunately, I'm forgetting the name of it, but I'll be announcing it soon. And yeah, we're still doing some showings. Also, we'll be dropping it on the podcast feeds. So if people want to listen to it now, Cole Memo dot listen or watch colememo.com/minidoc. And yeah, and part two may or may not be in the works, so we've got that
On
to look
hemp,
forward to.
possibly?
Oh, hemp will definitely be involved since, that's been a super integral part, I would say, of the Illinois story. But there are also just like, even today, the Illinois Supreme Court ruled, unfortunately, my mini documentary is still accurate in this regard, that the odor proof container, do you remember that part of the
Yes.
mini doc? The Supreme Court just ruled today, December 5th, that odor proof remains the law of the land. In other
Mm.
words, that impossible standard you have to comply with that I lay out in the mini doc, unfortunately, still it remains to be the case. So that'll have to be
Wow.
addressed via the legislature. I was hoping that part of my mini doc would be like, I
Out
wouldn't
of
say
date?
rendered inaccurate, but
Yeah.
outdated. Yes, outdated.
That's crazy because, like you said, a person can't control that.
And
Wow.
the thing that I learned from lawyers that I found most interesting is that the law makes it clear that it only applies to private vehicles. So, like, in other words, let me just put it this way. Instead of making it about vehicles, I've asked law enforcement agents, have you ever been to an Illinois dispensary? And they say, yeah, when we first legalized it, we got a tour so we could feel better about it and stuff, right? I said, when you went there, did it smell like cannabis? And they said, yeah, it did. I said, well, the cannabis is not packaged there. It comes there prepackaged, which means that it's not in an odor-proof container, which means that the moment you purchase it and get in your vehicle, you're out of compliance with the law. And that's when the light bulb goes off for some law enforcement officers.
Mhm.
Um, Unfortunately, as some lawyers have explained, there's a real profit motive to keep that skeleton key, as they call it, around, because you can get into people's cars if you just say it smells like cannabis,
Like a
right?
profit motive, like you mean for like the prison industry or?
Yeah, I would say so, because what the lawyers explain is that it usually starts with the smell of cannabis and ends with like asset forfeiture and other crimes. And
Mhm.
realize that the smell of cannabis in and of itself is a class A misdemeanor, which is
Jesus Christ.
equivalent to domestic violence. And just to quickly wrap this whole topic, the part that I found most intriguing, that I briefly cover in the mini documentary, but I didn't really emphasize the way that I'm about to, in 2000, between the years of 2016 and 2020, cannabis was decriminalized in Illinois. And if you were caught with a joint, let's say in your ear or in your front pocket, which I'm not saying we should be driving around with a joint in our ear and our front pocket.
Yeah,
Just,
maybe not behind your ear.
yeah, yeah. But for a colorful example,
Hmm.
you would have gotten a citation.
Hmm.
After legalization, that is, like I said, a class A misdemeanor with up to a year in prison. And
Wow.
so it's just kind of crazy how the penalties have gotten worse.
That is bananas.
Yeah.
Wow. I think
Um,
here in Massachusetts, our Supreme Court ruled that odor couldn't be used in this way, somewhere between decrim and legalization. I think before legalization, in fact.
nice. Yeah. And, I do have a little bit of hope. We can maybe end this particular topic with a hopeful note on, I believe it's footnote number 7 of today's ruling. Don't quote me on that, but there's a point in there I covered in my article that I just produced that says that the Supreme Court acknowledged that the legislature was considering removing this language, and that
Mm.
if that's the case, it's not like they're gonna. I mean, I don't believe they even are able to make an objection to that because it's the legislative process. But they've just acknowledged that this could soon change, and
Mm.
that's promising. Hopefully, the legislature takes the ball and runs with it, and says, "Hey, we
Is
have to."
there, yeah, once you get like a formal invitation like that, you really should take it. Is there
Mhm.
any expected like cannabis or hemp reform in Illinois that it could be like lumped in with?
So, from what I understand, that's a really great question. It was a part of the cannabis omnibus bill that was being proposed during the last session that a lot of social equity licensees were proponents of. Unfortunately, law enforcement voiced objections to that language being removed from the law, and as a result, they removed that clause from their bill. So, if to answer your question, if it were voted in lame duck session, I think there's a very small chance of that being incorporated because it would have to go back through all the houses and
Mm,
all through all the voting procedures.
I see.
It's more likely that it would have to be reintroduced during the next General Assembly, which is about to take place at the beginning of next month.
I see.
So, so
Interesting.
we'll see. To your point, the legislature also, when they were debating this issue and whether or not to remove it, I recall somebody saying, "Hey, similarly to what the Supreme Court just did, hey, the Supreme Court is about to rule on this, so maybe we don't have to do anything." Well, now they have to do something.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
so hopefully, like I say, they take the ball and run with it. But
Let's hope. Yeah.
yeah, well, I've been really excited to chat with you today, Shaleen. I wanted to just start off with, you just made a pretty, well, we've already kind of gotten head deep, but the topic I wanted to start off with today was you announced some next steps. Do you want to take the floor with regard to like what the future is looking like for you?
Sure. Yeah, yeah. And it's not, I mean, it's not even a big announcement. I feel actually very relaxed about it because usually my announcements involve some kind of big report or something, and I'm like, I have to get them in political, and now it's just, I'm just kind of stopping and I'm being like very relaxed about how I announce it. I'm ready for an extended break from drug policy after these decades. And so I'm going to stay and do some things behind the scenes. So I'm staying on as board chair at Parabola Center, but my real focus is going to be guiding new leaders, finding new leaders, building a pipeline. And I'm teaching an adjunct course as well. So I just kind of want to transition from being a leader to developing new leaders. Yeah,
Gotcha.
and maybe in working on something besides drug policy. We'll see.
Yeah. Cool. Cool. Well, that sounds super interesting. Sounds like maybe like a handing of the baton. And I say that like hesitantly because I think you're always, like I feel like I'm always gonna still hit you up like, hey, did you see this story type of thing? But I get what you mean. You're like kind of shifting to the new guard, if you will. Am I right in
Yes,
saying that?
I like that. Yeah, passing the torch, shifting to the new guard, all of that. Yeah. Just not in like, the formal way where you have one new person and then you step away completely.
Right.
It's not really the environment for that. So it's more like, tiptoeing away backwards slowly.
Okay. Good. That makes me feel better because that would, yeah, I want you to stay. So selfishly. I was gonna make the joke. You said I'm gonna take a break from drug policy reform, but I'm gonna do some things, behind the scenes. And I'm like, you're still gonna do drugs behind the scenes, right? You're not taking a break from drugs either, are you?
Yeah, maybe even more prominently.
There you go. There you go. Cool. Sorry for the lame joke. I just always have to with the subject matter of the show. Well,
Oh, it's part of your
um,
brand. You're obligated.
exactly, exactly. Well, hey, before we get to hemp, which is a topic I'm really excited to discuss with you, just while it's fresh on my mind, and I took some notes, you were on an OSU panel yesterday, and
Hmm.
there were a lot of things that I'd like to give you the space on to discuss if there was anything that you found worth recapping. But one of the things that really just like I was doing something else, and when you gave your prediction on the future, I didn't even realize they asked that, but you're like, my prediction for the future. And I was like, I like stopped what I was doing and listened to what you had to say. And I'm curious, would you be able to? I took some brief notes, but I don't want to say it for you. Would you be able to recap maybe what your prediction was and maybe unpack it as well?
Yeah, yeah, I can try. It was kind of on the fly, but
Sure.
what I said was I think we're unfortunately at the end of this era of legalization. The one I kind of grew up in, the one that started in the early 2000s, that is characterized by these diverse coalitions coming together. The activists, the ACLU, the NAACP, all the drug policy groups coming together with business and industry and with experts and scholars to pass these legalization laws. Um, I think if you look at the last election, but also with Florida and North Dakota and South Dakota, but also just the way that public opinion has been shifting. We've been seeing a lot more mainstream media narratives about the harms of marijuana use. And they're not, in my opinion, they're not reefer madness. They're people who have been pro legalization, just noticing and asking questions about how legalization is going, how marijuana use is going. A lot of the things that people like us have been raising red flags about the past several years because of industry concerns. And so I think what comes next is totally up in the air, but it will be different from this coalition. I mean, the other thing too is that especially looking at the most recent legalization campaigns, I think that they've just been recycling these talking points that we wrote in 2012. And they were based on talking to people at the time, really talking to people and understanding that like they felt that marijuana was safer than alcohol. They felt like the laws weren't working. They wanted, tax revenue. They wanted law enforcement to be doing something else. And like, did you just yawn?
I was coughing.
Sorry.
I'm sorry.
Sorry. So just they took those talking points, right? Because people knew they were being lied to by the government. And they're using them now in 2024, but it's just like a copy of a copy of a copy. They're not authentic anymore. And it's almost like people don't like to be lied to. I think they kind of know that they're being lied to by industry a little bit, that people who are saying these talking points don't believe them, that it's a lot more about profit. This is what I'm observing. And so and the last piece of evidence is our research that we did at Parabola Center last year, where we asked people, what values do you hold when it comes to legalization? Because the same number of people that every other survey, like 68 to 70%, said that they support legalization. But then we went further and we asked, what values do you hold? Whom do you trust? And the answers were very much the opposite of who's running the legalization movement today. They said, we don't trust alcohol, we don't trust tobacco, we don't trust big corporations. We want to see people who use cannabis benefit, but also people who have been harmed, workers, and most of all, patients. So that doesn't match. Those two things don't match. And so I think we're seeing the beginning of a backlash, and that backlash is going to get worse unless we completely change what we're doing as a movement.
Yeah. And, one of the things you sort of mentioned in not only now, but yesterday, I think is when the panel was. I don't know, time's a blur. Some of the talking points that have seemingly been effective, even though we might agree. I caught your word switch the other day. Some people use the argument against Florida as a monopoly, even though we're always saying like it's an oligopoly. But that argument was effective in Ohio as well, as you said, back in 2016. And so,
15.
yeah, 15. It's interesting how that has become, an effective talking point against incremental progress. And I want to be clear, I was not supportive of Amendment 3. I was supportive of parts of Amendment 3, like the 3-ounce possession limit makes Illinois possession limit look silly. Like,
What is
wow.
it in Illinois?
It's 30 grams for just adults, 15
Oh,
grams for
Jesus.
somebody like you.
Why did
Like for non-residents, I mean to say, of the state of Illinois.
why didn't the industry write that bill? Why'd they make it so small? I wonder.
Uh,
Ours is
that's
like
a
10
good question.
ounces.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
a good question. People speculate that it's because they want you to just purchase small amounts and not, get in bulk, but I don't really know the actual answer.
that's so interesting.
Yeah. But, it would make, and I mean, the city of Dallas just decriminalized 3 ounces of cannabis, which is pretty awesome. We had a Texas advocate from there. And to hear that, I was like, man, you guys are doing it big in Texas. Um, but, uh, but yeah, it's just it's interesting that talking point can even persuade people that I think don't use cannabis. You know what I mean? They're like,
Right. And maybe don't care.
right, and
Yeah.
maybe
I
don't
was so
care.
fascinated by that. Yeah, it does kind of seem, and I have I haven't studied this or anything, but just like observing between Colorado in 2012 and today and Florida, it felt like the people in the middle that's just defaulted to yes back then. And now I know Florida got a slim majority. They didn't meet the 60% that they needed. But I did sense from observing that the people in the middle were like, why we don't need to do this. Why would we give a monopoly to this corporation?
Yeah, and one of the things that I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on, and my apologies for at least one of these individuals who's been on the show, if you get offended for me lumping you in with this other individual, but like Luke from Sam and
Hmm.
Ron DeSantis have both vocally said like, why would you vote against this? It doesn't even legalize home grow. And the reason I lump them together, to be clear, to back up, is because I know that they're neither one of them are actually proponents of home grow. So
Hmm.
it was just interesting to see people like on the opposite side making really rational arguments against like, hey, if you actually support this, these are the checkbox list, topics that you want to make sure is included.
It was so fascinating, and it felt like kind of like they picked up our talking points, knowing that they're effective and using them. And like, I mean, it goes back to what I was saying earlier, where like the legalization movement hasn't evolved much since then. But Sam and whoever was running No on Three and Ron DeSantis, like they were quite slick in their presentation. Cause like I saw a few where Ron DeSantis was talking for 3 minutes, and in 3 minutes he threw in there like just first of all, we hate marijuana, reefer mad, young kids, blah, blah, all that in like 1 minute. Then he went on to being like, if you're a supporter of marijuana, this doesn't have home grow, it's a monopoly. And then went on to say, and by the way, this is going to turn us into, whatever state he hates, California, whatever liberal state, and there's going to be the smell of pot smoke everywhere. And I think that was really effective, as a persuasive message.
Yeah. Yeah, seriously. And I think I've displayed this graphic for you in the past, but this I think really caps off and maybe will help us to close out this conversation around your prediction. Our friend Box Brown, boxbrown.com, this is a snippet from one of his comics, and I'll read it for our listeners. One of my concerns is losing momentum for legalization. The Netherlands has a small, hobbled together cannabis market riddled with major problems. And there's an image of a person illegally transporting weed from illegal grow to legal shop. But they've lost the political will to fix it. Here's where I think your prediction comes in. The average person sees the cannabis issue as over. And maybe that doesn't totally speak to your original prediction, but I think maybe that's how we can, maybe that's a good segue. It's, I think your prediction before we move on was that we need to listen to people, you know, like about
Yeah, well,
their,
that was my proposed solution, absolutely. And yeah, Box's cartoon, they always resonate with me, but that one definitely resonated. I think it's political will that we're losing because people see the cannabis issue as over, but also nonprofits are not getting funding, unfortunately, especially nonprofits like MPP, that used to run these campaigns. And I bet if they were running Florida, probably would have won because that's their area of expertise. They're not getting funding. MPP and Normal, they almost tried to merge because the funders that used to fund these initiatives, they've either moved on to like psychedelics or whatever the new pet issue is, or they're like, this is over. There's an industry. The industry should be funding it. Not seeing the problem and the tension inherent there. But yeah, so my proposed solution was a listening session, which again we did before 2012, and that's why those initiatives were so successful. Go out and ask people, how are you experiencing legalization? Because one thing I see a lot is people say, it's too potent for me. My friends are having problems. I'm having problems. I don't like smelling smoke everywhere. My kids are seeing billboards, problems with vapes in the bathrooms. Like these are all things that so many people in our movement just inherently, instinctively dismiss. And they just want to tell people, no, it's not true. We're just present a chart. And that is not a winning strategy. We have to listen to what they're saying before doing anything else.
yeah, well said. Sometimes I get flack for having the folks from, speaking of smart approaches to marijuana, I have them on my show. It's because I do think that they do have some valid concerns, and often, at least Jordan seems to see my side of the issue as well, where it's like you said, it's like the public use thing, just to use that as a quick example. Like I'm of the belief that like, yeah, you should be respectful, and only smoke cannabis where you smoke cigarettes, and those locations are becoming few and far between because we're changing as a society, right? And it's yeah, it's just interesting how, as you said earlier, and as I've experienced, you can almost get it's like a circular firing squad. Obama once said, if you step out of motion a little bit, that a circular firing squad will take you down for just getting a little bit out of purity. I'm going
Hmm.
off the top of my head right now, but if you
No,
could
it's so
look up,
true. That's so true.
and it feels like that's what the cannabis movement has become in some ways. Like you said, kind of not not revolving or evolving rather with the times.
I mean, and that's a big part of why I want to leave, honestly. That's what I'm so repulsed by, is like the exact thing that attracted me to this movement was the critical thinking. And now yeah, I don't see much critical thinking. And even if you're like a shareholder of Trulieve and you don't care at all about anything social justice related, right? You just want to see any kind of reform. Um, I don't know why they'd be listening to your show, but even if that was the case, you still have to pay attention to this, because do you want to keep losing? If we don't address these things, if we don't listen to people, um, we are going to end up in such a backlash that, I mean, it could go as far as the state reversing legalization. Like, I don't see that happening, but things like that have happened in the past, and like you said, the circular firing squad. I heard the reporter who wrote that New York Times article that said, as marijuana use grows, so do its harms. And her point was that she was very clear. The vast majority of people who use cannabis don't have any problems at all, but the small number of people who do, that's growing. And she said, like, she's never been targeted, or she was very surprised by how targeted she was when she just posted her article. And people were like, well, what side are you on? No, that's not who we want to be, first of all. And second of all, it's not a winning strategy at all.
Right, right. Yeah, it's like you ask a simple question like maybe smoking anything isn't healthy for you. Again, we're not
How
saying
dare
look,
you?
I smoked a joint, before we got on the show. I don't plan to stop.
You're probably going to smoke one like while we're talking, but it's still a
Well,
very valid question.
yeah, I forgot my rolling stuff in the other room, so unfortunately that won't be happening. But it would be
Oh,
if
man,
I
that's the highlight of the show usually.
yeah, usually I am consuming exactly. No, but um see, yeah, it's just interesting times we're living in where you can't even make a logical statement like that. It's not like I'm not chiefing it up most of the day, but I also would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge like maybe I'm coughing because this isn't healthy for me. Like my body
See,
is,
yes. And I will say, like, the nice part about this is that it's really creating an opening for new leaders. And I would especially say people who have public health backgrounds or even an interest. If you're able to engage with these questions in a thoughtful way, where you're not coming off as knee jerk or prohibitionist, there's so much room for you to be the next leader. I think that especially people who have studied public health like very recently, and who do public surveys. um, I'm so surprised like that we don't hear from them very often. Even again, I keep referencing that article, but it didn't have any statistics in it. It was just all vibes. It was all like, here's the people that we talk to about what they're experiencing. We have to have research. We have to have tweaking of these regulations instead of just talking about them in theory. And those people are they're gonna shoot to prominence. They're gonna be totally successful. They're gonna get appointed to all kinds of positions. So if you're listening and that's you, be heartened by that.
right. And I think we should also, maybe this is a good segue here, and cap for this subject. Safety, this is from, I'll tell you who I'm quoting loosely here in a moment. Safety is not the point. Even, cannabis legalization and drug legalization is constantly couched in how safe or therapeutic or medicinal or whatever, insert word here, they are. And that's not the point. Cognitive liberty is the point. Like we have the right and I think it's important to remind folks of this. Like while I'm sitting here saying maybe it's not safe, we remind ourselves like safety is not really the total point. Like, yes, it's an achievable end goal. I'm not saying we can't work to make these products safer, but it's all about cognitive liberty and the idea that, especially in a free country, we have the ability to engage in risks as adults, right? And I'm loosely quoting who has become, I think, a controversial figure, Hamilton Morris, though. This was an old quote from Hamilton Morris that has always kind of resonated with me.
Mm,
The point really is cognitive liberty, and that the
mm,
government shouldn't have the right to prevent you from exploring these states of consciousness,
mm-hmm,
regardless of whether or not they're safe.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What's funny is that's probably the biggest argument that I had with my mentors in 2012 when I first started, because their accurate strategy was that if they started out with a campaign that said marijuana is safer than alcohol, before they even introduced the idea of legalization, that it would make people more open to the idea. And that did seem to pan out. But I always said, like, that's not the point of legalization. That's not the point of regulation. It doesn't matter if it's safe or not. And I still believe that. Yeah. So I'm with you. It's about cognitive liberty. And just as a PS, like another reason I feel like I'm done with drug policy is that I feel like it's not small, but there are so many other issues that are affecting our freedom of thought. Definitely AI, definitely corporate capture in all of these different areas. And so, like, if that's something that people appreciate, they should not take it for granted right now.
Well said. Well said. And you know, kind of in the spirit of where the cannabis movement used to be and where I think it should be. I think it'd be interested, or where I think it's heading, or maybe could head. I think it'd be interesting to transition to hemp. I recently wrote a policy outline because I was discussing the topic with you, and I was like, I feel like this is, and I want to start with this, maybe the coolest thing that has ever happened to cannabis so far, but also maybe the scariest thing because it doesn't include some of the policy proposals that we have both, specifically you, but I echo, have espoused. Some policy proposals, specifically like protection against monopolies and stuff like that. Like we don't see that at all with hemp, but not to just dive head deep in. I wanted to back up. Like I said, I wanted to just kind of quickly give you like a one pager. It ended up being a three pager. And I'll share it if my audience would like to read it. But I'm just curious before we dive in, like, you said it had reminded you of like somebody you had worked with in the past, like at least the concepts that I had laid out. Um, like maybe a professor or something. Curious, what were
Yeah.
your thoughts on this?
Well, first of all, just in the vein of wanting to just guide and uplift new leaders, I I said, like, let me come on your show because I want to interview you about hemp, because I've always come to your writings and your just thoughts on hemp because I felt like they're really focused on what's important, and also not having like the panicked hysteria as a lot of the things that I read on hemp from my peers, especially other regulators. So I wanted to just ask you about your thoughts, and I'm glad that it led to that outline. But I just want to start by asking, what do you think led to the situation that we have currently with hemp, like the Farm Bill, but then any other factors?
Yeah. So like basically how I understand it, like how we got to where we are today is in 2014 there was the Farm Bill, or sorry, Industrial Hemp Act, which was part of the Farm Bill. And then in 2018 they modified that. They actually dropped the word industrial and it just became the Hemp Farming Act of 2018, I believe. Might be a little bit wrong on that, but the point is the word industrial was dropped. They added a host of consumable cannabinoids, which is like they specifically spelled out like THCV, like a lot of different cannabinoids, salts of cannabinoids, acids, things that I don't even really understand. It got very scientific, because I don't think any of us looked at cannabis that way. We just like we started to have a concept of THC percentage, but all these other cannabinoids, like that's kind of been a thing that's come out of legalization. So like
Mhm.
I'm not going to pretend to understand that particular part, but the long story short is that in 2018, they dropped that term industrial, from what I understand, added this host of cannabinoids, which are consumable. Like, it's what we see on COAs, oftentimes for cannabinoid products. And so at the beginning of it, I think people were like, still kind of on the cutting edge of understanding it. And so that's why you just saw a preponderance of CBD products. I don't know if you remember, but there was like an explosion of CBD products.
Mhm.
Uh,
Definitely remember.
there's a
Wait, by the
local,
way, is it known like how that happened? Who lobbied for it?
now that's the $1 million question. And that's what I love to, I'm glad you asked. Thank you for like backing up and asking that question, because my speculation on that, no, I don't know. I'm sure somebody knows. But my speculation on that is that, yes, somebody wrote the language that way. I don't know who to
Mm.
directly answer your question, but they were all just like, "Hey, if we all shut the fuck up, like cannabis is pretty much going to be legalized,
Mm.
and just let them sign the law and pass it through, just like all of the other legislation we see, right?
Mhm.
Where oftentimes it's not the legislators themselves crafting it. It's some, like you say, lobbyist that has crafted it. And I think it was a crafty one, a
Mhm.
real, smart one. And he just kind of like slipped it under, and this happened. And like you said, or like I was going to say, it took a few years for people to understand. But I remember in 2019, a person that has been on my show several times is a super like anti-hemp person now. Like self-admittedly, he's come on my show and debated anti-hemp. Like so he wouldn't take me saying that as a diss. In 2019, he was looking at COAs for cannabis, and he was like, from a dispensary, and he was like, this cannabis is mostly THCA and it's under 0.3% THC. And he's like, so by the farm bill, he's like, this could be hemp. And he was like, kind of, it seemed like almost jokingly like he
Mm.
was saying it, but he was, saying it. And that was at least the first time I had heard of it. Uh,
By the way,
somebody,
who was that?
Tom Howard. Thank you for asking me that as well. Yeah, he's a cannabis industry lawyer, Tom Howard. If people want to check out, I had him on the show recently to talk about, his perspective. And we've had him on a few times actually to talk about his perspective. But yeah, he had originally kind of that was the first person I had seen hypothesize that you could like sell legitimate weed as
Mhm.
hemp if you just call it hemp and say, well, it's under 0.3% THC. Um, it's hemp. And it wasn't until I would say 2021, 2022, and especially these last few years that I've really seen people like lean into it and just full blown, like Cookies, for example, a pretty well known cannabis brand. They're just selling THCA hemp flower just through the mail. I think for a while you could literally buy a pound. It was kind of crazy
Through the mail? Wow.
through the
Didn't know that.
mail. There are other companies, that are local. This company actually has a cannabis license in Illinois, and they make these sodas. Now, these are for me only because they're 50 milligrams a can. I'm
Ugh.
saying that jokingly, just because I like my doses pretty high. But they make like lower
Are
dosage,
you
and
one
they,
of those people where like edibles don't work on you unless they're really high doses?
yeah. Or if I take a pretty good break, edibles become a little bit more effective. But as we were discussing earlier, I just consume so regularly that I think it just my tolerance is higher.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, it's just kind of crazy because all of a sudden companies start sending products like these through the mail that you look at it and you're like, this is crazy. I just got sent weed through the fucking mail legally. All they had to do was put a little piece of paper in there and say it's hemp.
Yeah, it happened so gradually. I remember we probably all have a story of like when we first realized it, but I remember being in a liquor store It might have been like when I was still a regulator, because it might have been like 2020. And I saw, I think it was labeled CBD, but it was also like very clearly being marketed as a cannabis drink. And we bought it. We were like, what the hell is this? But I was thinking, like, I don't know what happened here, but I bought it in a liquor store. Like, obviously, this is regulated. And then we drank it and we found it like nasty. So then we never drank it again. But it was like shortly after that that the hysteria started. And like, I didn't really know how to think about it because I didn't find it to be like gas station weed, like to be scared of. Like, I didn't see my kid going out and buying it, you know? And also like I didn't like it, but not like I went to the hospital or anything. And
Right.
I just felt like I don't know, I don't want to say it was safe, but I also felt like the hysteria from then till now saying that, you know, this is completely unregulated and like it's going to cause all these problems, like just felt a little bit overblown to me. I don't know, what do you think?
Oh, I completely agree. I mean, so I got my hands on documents from like some of the largest cannabis companies here in Illinois that just basically spell out that they are pushing these stories of unregulated,
Mm.
weed at gas stations. Like there's a lot of buzzwords, by the way. Unregulated, untested, unsafe weed at gas stations.
Mhm.
This THC soup. you know,
I
uh,
haven't heard THC.
yeah. I
That's an
mean,
effective one.
there was a really interesting one just today, or rather yesterday, where so this a little bit. This isn't related to the PR push that I was just talking about, but there's just interesting like vernacular being used in Texas. They're saying dangerously, retailers exploited the agricultural law to sell life-threatening, unregulated THC to the public and made them easily accessible. These
Mm,
stores not only sold to adults, but they targeted Texas children and exposed them to dangerous levels of THC. And
mm.
I'll just wrap it up by here's another like hazardous THC product. Like when did I'll complete this thought in a second. Under Senate bill, these products and all forms of THC will be banned in Texas. So they're like adding like an
Mm.
extra, nail into the prohibition casket. I feel like this talking point that you're noticing and that hysteria you're noticing is very similar to how all of a sudden the illicit market became toxic. Have you ever also heard?
Yes. Oh, that's
Yeah.
such a good point. Yes.
Yeah, it's
Overnight.
that. Right.
Mm.
And look, I get there is some the problem with the arguments that we're talking about right now is that there is some validity to it, and that's actually what I
Right.
tried to
Just
acknowledge
like
in
the
my
illicit market argument, there's a grain of truth there.
grain of truth. Yep. But like we should remind ourselves is, and I'm saying this for our listeners, not really for you, but it's like the traditional market has, or the illicit market has supplied all of us for years. So I've been asking, like, when did it become toxic? Because that was always the argument before it was legal, is that like, hey, everybody's smoking it anyways, and you can't die from it. Like it was literally like a cliche talking point. And all of a sudden with legalization, illicit cannabis became toxic. It's like, how? you know?
P.S. I really wanted to say that in my panel yesterday, which was like a scholarly panel, and the guy's a trade organization representative. I love him, but like you know, he had to do his job. And when I was saying, you know, don't speed up sales at the expense of equity, he was like, "Well, we have to be very, very serious because there's illicit there's illicit product out there, you know." And I don't know what word he used, but he was like, "You know, we don't want people to be poisoned, so we had to hurry up and speed up the sales." Like,
Oh, I didn't catch that. I'll have to. I'm sure they usually post them on YouTube. So if I see that, I'll try to
but
post
you've
them
heard
off
it
of you.
100 times, I'm
Yes.
sure, you know? And yeah, you're right. Like there's a grain of truth to it, but yeah, I get it now. Same thing with the hysteria because they have it was leading to hemp bans, right? That was the whole point there.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. It's all this language which has often been funded, or at least in Illinois. I can't speak nationally, but I would. Do you think they're only doing this in Illinois? Like they're paying for stories to be pushed in the media to include this language.
Mm. Like
And it's
paying
just
PR firms.
yes, yeah,
Mm.
paying PR firms, pretty influential ones at that. And it's just so interesting because in many ways they're using reefer madness era talking points. Like the lead representative for the legislation in Illinois last session that would have everybody was calling it a hemp ban. Really, what it would have done is just everybody that was licensed under the Cannabis Act, the limited number of licensees, those would have been the only people that can sell cannabis products, and hemp would have been lumped under that. So it essentially would have been a ban, let's call it a
Hmm.
soft ban. One of the things she said going into the end of last session was uh, to somebody that was basically saying we're not selling illegal products. These are federally legal products, and we're happy to be regulated if that would address your
Hmm.
public safety concerns. And the lead sponsor's response was, you are selling illegal products, and you will not be allowed to kill off our children this summer. If you
Oh
want to
dear.
sell cannabis, get yourself legalized. And it's like when somebody says something so flippantly like that, it'd be one thing if it was as easy as just like, oh, I'll buy a cannabis license. But that's not the case
Right.
in Illinois
Right.
or
It's
in a
not
lot of
like
these.
fishing. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, you can't exactly. What's crazy is that's a recent example that was given to me by Dan Lin, who you actually may have known.
I know Dan Lin. Yeah.
Yeah, he was saying that, really the analogy he used when he came on the podcast recently was that cannabis licensing should be like going and getting a hunting license or a fishing license. Like you
Hmm.
go, you buy it, it's a pretty nominal fee, you
Hmm.
know, in and you're out. And that's to wrap it back to hemp. That's what's crazy is uh, the first interview I ever did with David Lakeman, and it is before this issue ever like was even on our radars. Because again, this was in like 2020 or something. I was just asking him about hemp licensing and cannabis licensing. And I said, David, if I would have bought a hemp license today, when would I get it? And he said, Cole, you'd be walking out with one this afternoon, after our interview. And I was like,
Hmm.
why isn't cannabis licensing like that? And I don't mean to take us on a tangent away from hemp for a moment, but I did realize that I missed something that I wanted to talk about with the OSU panel that I think lumps into this. I
Sure. And
asked,
while you get that moment of silence for Massachusetts and the fact that David Lakeman is not, in fact, coming here to be our executive director is
yeah,
absolutely awful, awful, awful news.
thank you, by the way, for saying that. I wrote an article about that. If folks want to read it, I'll paste it in the show notes. One of his responses, and I'm not throwing David under the bus because he's not the only person to say this. This is something that many Illinois cannabis regulators have said. Something that a cannabis regulator, I think, said yesterday. His name was Thomas. He was talking about like how we want to prevent saturation of the market, which is I feel like it's basically a counterpoint to what we were just talking about, making a license easy to get. And my question that I asked as an anonymous attendee yesterday, because I was like, I don't know, I don't want to like put too many pressure on if people know who I am, you know what I mean? I want it to just come off as like a soft question. And I asked, why do cannabis regulators prioritize ensuring the success of licensees, unlike other industries like restaurants, where the focus is on consumer safety and compliance? I understand that some industries like utilities also regulate market saturation, but why does cannabis fall into this type of category? Why is oversaturation prevented to protect licensees rather than allowing market forces to just determine that success? I'm genuinely curious. What did you think about that question that I asked? And
Yeah, I think
I,
that's a really
if it was
mhm,
unclear, by the way,
mhm,
how that looped in with what I said about David Lakeman, he told me,
mhm.
Cole, I get your point, but he's like, the prices would just fall so low and the market would basically crash if we just let everybody, it would be a race to the bottom, you know?
Ah, yeah. So that's like one of the things I was going to say makes it like maybe valid. Like this is definitely a question to explore because it's absolutely not black or white because you can't say like we're on the side of making the industry successful, even though I have heard regulators say that and it definitely gives me pause. You can't say that because you're there to regulate them. Like obviously there's
Right.
supposed to be attention there. You got to make sure that they follow the law. But then on the other hand, it is historically common that you might have things like price floors or price ceilings because you are needing to protect the public. That's your primary goal. But part of protecting the public is making sure that the industry, if not successful, at least has a chance. I think if the industry doesn't have a chance, or, you make regulations that are impossible to comply with, then obviously you're not doing your job either. And when people talk about oversaturation, or they talk about prices becoming so low, and I'm not saying I necessarily agree with this argument, but I think it's like a valid position to hold. They talk about prices becoming so low that either businesses can't survive, or it's causing public health concerns, or both. I think it's something to talk about. I think that's fair. People have brought that up in Massachusetts a lot, some legitimately, and some as part of this front where they're talking about a cannabis omnibus bill, and the whole point is just to lift our ownership caps. And that's very obvious to me. But either way, I do think it's fair to say, let's have a conversation about where all of the numbers are in the state right now. Are we meeting consumers' needs? Is there enough access? And then, of course, with the ever scary illicit market, we do want people to at least gradually be shifting to the regulated market. And if they're not, then we have to worry about, we do want to open more stores. We do want to make sure that there's access. And if there's too many, oversaturation problems are real. So all of that to answer your question is that I do think it's a fair conversation, but anyone who says we're either part of making the industry successful, or we have absolutely nothing to do with whether they're successful or not, they're oversimplifying the situation.
Yeah. And maybe it's just because I love Michigan, but Michigan was used as the example yesterday. It's been used as the example by our head regulator in Illinois as a failure because of price compression and receivership. And my thing is to your point, so they'll say, oh, it's an oversaturated market and everything. And one of the other points you brought up was we want people to participate in the market. And what I feel like Michigan has done is they've made you seem silly as a consumer and a business person if you don't participate in the legal market. In other words, they've made it
Mm.
so easy to just, as a consumer and as a business person, to get involved, that it's you might as well get a license, because why get in trouble if it's that easy? And that's
Mm,
I think an interesting thing to balance. I don't know how we
definitely.
balance that.
Definitely, yeah. But if you're getting at, I think correctly, that some of this might be being pushed by certain parties, like the whole "why is everybody bringing up Michigan all of a sudden?" I think that is true. In my day, it was Oregon. I don't know if you were paying
Yeah.
attention then, but every regulator would be like, "We don't want to be like Oregon. They have a total oversupply. It's so scary. We can't have an oversupply under any circumstances." And are those things planted? Yes, of course they are.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just a frustrating one for me because it's I guess it ties back into my mini documentary when people prevent other people from participating in the legal market on the justification that we might go out of business or the prices might fall too much. It just sucks that at least in most states, including Illinois, the criminal law is the enforcement mechanism. So it's you couldn't get a license, too bad. And guess what? You're a criminal.
Mm,
you know, it's
mm.
man, I wish we could just find
That's what Jim Belushi said too, right?
right. And I think actually, Jim, thank you for bringing that up. I think Jim and I, we sh in a weird way, I actually think we agree. Now, hear me out. What he described, because that clip went more viral than some of my other clips. What he described was a violent criminal operation. And I am
Mm,
all for pursuing and allowing law enforcement to focus on violent and property crime. By the way, that's the first few words from the Illinois Cannabis Regulation and Tax Act, in the interest of allowing law enforcement to focus on violent and property crime. So
mm,
yeah, go for it. And if somebody's brandishing a firearm like he you know, suggested they did to him. And if it's a cartel situation, truly, oftentimes they're employing forced labor. There's a lot of different violent infractions you
sure.
can go after those people for. But the simple act of cultivating cannabis, as long as you're not tainting it with pesticides or whatever, that is a nonviolent offense. And I think actually Jim Belushi and I would agree on that. I think he got I don't know. Some other people say I'm giving him too much benefit of the doubt. But I do think that because the reason I say that is because he's also made another statement that he believes nonviolent cannabis offenders should not be imprisoned. And what he
Mm.
described
Was
was
that
not
subsequent to that Q&A? Just
that was
curious.
prior actually, and I really wish I would have known that he had said that, you know what I mean? Because I would have been able to clarify, like, okay, what you just painted was a violent
Mm.
offense. Somebody literally brandished a firearm against you. Like
Mhm.
that is a violent offense. Different
I think
story.
you're being quite generous for what it's worth. But yeah, I mean, maybe he just like got caught up in the moment. But if he did immediately from a illicit market think of another crime and then respond by saying we have to respond with law enforcement, that in itself is a problem because we shouldn't have those things so closely linked. And just like as a quick timeout, I absolutely agree that if we are talking about a different offense and not a cannabis offense, then law enforcement may or may not be required, but it's a whole
Sure.
separate conversation than if we're talking about just cannabis offenses themselves. But there is a big problem with disparate enforcement that's been targeting Black and Brown communities involving things like firearm charges, and those things are tied in such a way that there's no clear demarcation between nonviolent and violent in the way that I think some
Mm,
people like there to be. So I always just like to pause and point that out.
thank you. Yeah, no, that is important. That is an important distinction. And by the way, I just wanted to be mindful of our time. You get to go for about like 15 more minutes or so, just so we can close out on hemp.
I can go for however long because I keep hearing that you're not like a good leader right now unless you can sit down for like 5 hours on a
Hey,
mic.
hell yeah. You know what's
So
funny
I
is
want to have eyes.
I recently interviewed like a Republican congressperson actually about the hemp issue, which was interesting because they don't support legalization, but th- back to our original point, he understood my point about protectionist legislation. And he's like, look, this is business. I don't support the business, but if there's a big business interest trying to stomp out small businesses, I get that. We see that all the time in Illinois. Um, and
That's
to your
awesome.
point, though, of if you're wondering why I brought that up, he's like, yeah, well, you got to do podcasts now. He's like, our president just got elected because he did a 3 hour one, so I guess everybody's got to. We won't do three, I promise. But
People
um,
my age is crazy because we were trained on if you're going on a like the evening news,
mhm,
and you do like a 10-minute back and forth interview, you have to make sure that your every one sentence is perfect if it's taken out of context because that's how they're going to show it on the news, right? So to go from being trained, I was very good at that to now like, yeah, you got to sit down for 2 hours. I'm working on my endurance.
hell yeah, cool.
Sorry,
Well,
can I just like reframe the conversation? So, because
yeah,
I'm supposed to be interviewing you for this portion about
oh
hemp, we
yeah,
went on like 10 tangents.
sorry.
But I do want to, after you finish your current point, come back to the outline. What do you think is working for hemp and what isn't working?
Yeah, I feel like we went on a pretty crazy tangent, and I don't really know how to wrap that in other than just by getting back into it. Maybe this is a good way to wrap it in, just in case people don't understand still what we're talking about, and then we can pick up from there. This is another graphic from Box Brown that just explains what we're talking about. Sometimes people get confused about the 0.3% and how hemp is defined, and so there's this graphic, and you can see it on my screen right now, right?
Hmm.
And it basically shows, if you have a low portion of a gummy, in this instance, being THC, and most of it being other ingredients like gelatin, sugar, cornstarch, even CBD, as long as you remain under that 0.3% THC by volume, the product is in fact hemp. Now, this is where I think we can get back to your question. Well, sorry, I want to get back to your question and just say that hemp and marijuana are legal terms,
Mm,
while cannabis is a botanical term. And
mm-hmm.
that I think is another thing that confuses people because they hear hemp and they think, oh, isn't that like the cousin of marijuana or the cousin of cannabis? They say something to that effect. And it's like, now I really wish we had like a clear, like, distinction on that right now, but we really just, we don't,
Yeah.
so anyways, though, let's get back on track. Thank you for, because we definitely did go on a few tangents. What was your next question? This is cool, by the way.
Um, I have one minor question, and then I want to get back to the just general good and bad lessons.
Yeah, yeah.
So my, not minor, but the side question I wanted to ask you is like, um, I described my observation earlier, but I don't want to be flippant about it because I do realize that there are people and children who have gone to the emergency room after ingesting these products and that it's a real problem. I don't know how big it is, but that it exists. So I wanted to ask, just in terms of whether these need to be more regulated, and maybe this is a segue to the positive and negative parts of the current policy. What do you think about if the processing that's being used, the chemicals that are being used, if those are causing problems versus the cannabinoids and the hemp itself?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very, very real issue that I try to address as I'm pulling up my policy memo now through testing requirements. You know, s- I would say that I think this is just a brief tangent, I promise. In 2019, as an Illinois medical patient, I purchased Delta 8 from a dispensary.
Mm.
Whoa, that's crazy, right? But it
Mhm.
shows you that these products can be sold and regulated under a legal cannabis tax framework. And I guess my point is, I don't personally like Delta 8 or especially some of these like synthetics that do require, like, I'm not seeking them out. I don't know. Actually, I only know one person that does. It's a woman in a wheelchair. She uses Delta 8. Kind of an interesting story. I'd love to have her on the show sometime.
Mm.
But with regard to these synthetics and everything else, I do think there are real concerns, and it goes a little bit above my head, which is why I try to propose the simple solution, which is just that we should test these products, and if there are other solvents or chemicals detected, then those should not be, permitted. Especially if they're known to be harmful or kind of in the Wild West. And I guess to give you an example, um, and this will further illustrate how, you know, I don't know much about this specific topic, but Adam Terry, who runs Cantrip, hemp derived beverage, he's very particular
Oh,
about,
Massachusetts.
yeah, actually, yes, I didn't think about that. Um, he's very particular about naturally derived hemp, and it's apparently, and I've talked to different suppliers, they have pretty hard to find. It sounds like naturally derived THC, I mean to say, because what some of these THC products are is exactly what you discussed, where they've taken this bulk CBD that is probably still from the 2018, 2019 days, just speculating, and converting it to THC because you can do that. In fact, University of Illinois, Roger Adams did that in 1942 before.
Really?
But yeah, many people give Mekulam, an Israeli researcher, the credit for
Yeah.
discovering THC, but
Yeah.
it was in fact, from what I understand, Roger Adams at the University of Illinois who first synthesized it from
No shit.
CBD. Yeah, so
Uh-huh.
Google that, folks. Very interesting. And there's a building that has his name on it at the University of Illinois still to this day. Um, that's a long way of saying that that's one of my biggest concerns. And I don't know that I really answered your question, but I think my proposal, which we can share here in a moment, we can actually like go through this. But I wanted to like try to answer your questions before we did. I think my proposal and the requirement of testing will naturally address the concerns of like what's in this product, but it also weed out um, any synthetic cannabinoid concerns by requiring adherence to GMP standards. So like
Mhm.
I I don't know much about GMP standards, but the idea is that any solvents or chemicals or anything that wouldn't be allowed under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act today should not be allowed in cannabis products,
Mhm.
you know?
Yeah.
And maybe that's too simplistic of a approach, but again, given my like limited knowledge, I'm starting there.
I think that's a totally valid starting
You know
point.
what I
Yeah.
mean?
Hmm.
So I don't know
Do
if
you see
I,
a role for, you did, but just curious, do you see a role for state governments as well, or do you feel this should be regulated federally?
that's a really good question right now because states, as I just read in MJ Biz Daily, and as I've covered recently from David Lakeman, not only his interview at CCC, but we've been corresponding. States are starting to create their own testing labs because the third party testing infrastructure that we have in this country is, I'm just going to say it, a joke. The reporting is shown not only from Chicago Sun-Times, but there was a recent report out of California with, allegations of lab shopping, inflated potency, tainted
The
products
pretty
being on the
damning one
shelves.
from Wall Street Journal as well.
Yeah, yeah. I think there was a story out of Massachusetts as well with tainted products being on the shelves, like a secret shopper program or something like that. I can't remember. Um, the point is, to answer your question, it's hard to answer your question because, opponents of hemp argue that unsafe, unregulated hemp is dangerous. But then you also look at, okay, so if cannabis is so safe, let's look at their testing and it's riddled with errors. So it's hard to answer your question because it seems like the new standard is becoming state-based testing labs, which are supposed to be the like unbiased source, right? And let's hope that is the case. But I don't really know. Like if that turns out to be a good thing, state-based, I think is the way to go. I know that the DEA has labs that they can test things for and have tested things for. I also know that amongst the hemp crowd, that's a pretty controversial proposal. They're like, why would we work
Which
with the
part?
DEA?
Oh,
Yeah,
got
I
it. The
guess.
DEA testing. Mhm.
Yeah. So that came up recently in Illinois where they were suggesting hemp growers could work with DEA labs, and they were like, "Oh, I don't want to work with the fucking DEA. I'll work with one of the third party testing labs or when the state starts their own lab. But I feel like I don't
Yeah,
have an
sometimes
answer to
it's
that one yet.
important. No, that was a pretty insightful answer. I think that just like on the DEA part, like we have to think about what the DEA and ONDCP will do after legalization, and that's like an actual real question. I think. I mean, who knows with the current administration? But I bring it up because Harry Anslinger, a lot of people think that his motivation in going after all of the communities that were using marijuana in the 1930s was because he had been using, or his office had previously been in charge of alcohol prohibition and they had nothing to do. So we think it's something for the DEA to do. That's not a terrible idea.
Yeah. So yeah, just to put it in a bottle, state, federal testing. I don't exactly know. I mean, that's I guess the question is if you've got to conform with GMP standards. I think that kind of falls on local health departments in certain ways too.
Sure. Yeah.
Um,
I think probably it makes sense to like see one state implement the state testing lab idea and see how it goes before deciding whether, it works and should be expanded further.
right. I'm so glad you asked this question though, because it's like it just completely pokes a hole in a lot of the buzzwords we started with, the unsafe, unregulated, cannabis. It's like, again, I'm not saying that any of our state cannabis markets are flawed to wit's end, but to suggest that they're the golden standard, which is what it seems like a lot of these people, they're like, if you want safe cannabis, go to the dispensary. Otherwise, it's illicit, toxic cannabis, right?
Right.
So,
Right.
like I say, it's like I'm all for putting people under the same umbrella, which is um, what a lot of people are talking about. It's like these should all be treated the same. It's like, exactly. We should also focus on improving our testing standards, you know?
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. So do you want to go through what you see as the benefits of hemp policy and the problems?
Yeah, sure. And I think maybe for this, we can maybe refer to my article.
Yeah. I'm going to grab my parabola diagram to take you back to the first question about professor I mentioned.
Oh, yeah. And I will make it so that you can share your screen if you need to. Um, I'll just pause this while you grab that. Cool. Oh, that was back on your bookshelf. Okay, I thought that's what I saw. Hell yeah.
Yeah. Want me to go through this first real quick?
Yes, please. I'll put you on the big screen.
Okay, so this is the drug policy parabola that was created originally by Dr. John Marks about 50 years ago. And this is what I always used to pull out before I created Parabola Center when people would act like the idea of industry issues and problems were new. They'd be like, oh, haha, you legalized marijuana, and now you're like so surprised that the corporations and capitalism, blah, blah, blah. And like I would always pull this up from like 1940 or whatever because it has always been what drug legalization proponents have pointed out, which is that we were here at prohibition. This is a graph of harm. Sorry, this is the graph of harm, and this is where we are under prohibition. And this is everything that you see with prohibition in terms of arrests, incarceration, unregulated products. But if you go all the way to deregulation, you end up with an unchecked corporate power. And this is where alcohol and tobacco and some would say big tech and food and many other industries are, where they are completely unregulated and causing just as much harm. And so where we want to be is in the sweet spot of regulation where you're focusing on protecting your workers and consumers and preventing monopolies. And so the reason I brought it up when I saw your hemp outline was that even though you haven't seen that explicitly, I thought that was the kind of lens that you were approaching it through. And I like that.
Yeah, no, and actually it's something that it's a chart I had seen you display in the past, and it's something that somebody that's not even associated with Parabola Center came on my podcast and they showed me the chart, and I was like, I know that chart. Did you get that from Parabola Center? And they're like, no, this is just a. I think they referenced the person that you um
Dr. John Marks, yeah.
yeah had suggested. So I guess just for some background, like brief background, and then we'll talk good and bad, like. I just wanted to like set the stage by saying that like to acknowledge that the state legal cannabis industries face several challenges due to their federal illegality, including the burden of 280E taxes, lack of access to banking services, inability to accept credit cards, restrictions on direct to consumer sales,
Mm.
or access to traditional retail channels. They're also not able to list on stock exchanges, register trademarks, raise capital efficiently, or file copyrights, from what I've been told. In contrast, what has become federally legal hemp enjoys the freedom from those challenges because it is federally legal. And again, this is just to briefly set the stage. I've been trying, and I feel like I haven't found a good way to make this resonate with people, and I worry sometimes that people misunderstand this point that I make, but I think, you know, we should remind ourselves that medical cannabis, to the admission of some of the early advocates, was a Trojan horse for what became adult use cannabis. And I'm not saying, sometimes people misunderstand me and they're saying, are you just saying that we faked medical can? No, no, no. Cannabis undeniably offers real medicinal benefits. We'd just be remiss not to acknowledge that these laws also pave the way for broader adult use access. And
Maybe they're hearing it in a negative connotation, but you mean it in a positive one.
right, that's what I mean. Exactly. That when I say that we'd be remiss if we didn't acknowledge that it was a Trojan horse, they're saying I think they misunderstand me to say that we were like faking that there were
Mhm.
medicinal benefits, which is not what I'm saying. And in fact, the cannabis community never rejected those laws over the narrow intent. In other words, the narrow intent was
Mm,
supposed to be that it was for sick people, right? It
right.
became sort of a joke that you could like stub your toe and get a fucking medical marijuana card, but nobody had a problem with that. No, like we were
Yeah.
all just like, yeah, I mean, it should be that way. It's a little silly. We have to go to get a card from our doctor for it, but hey, progress is progress. That was the
Right.
attitude.
And like it wasn't some people might say it was incrementalism versus, the whole thing, but I think an important question is like incremental towards what, right? And those laws
Yes.
were incremental towards helping patients versus, another group.
Yeah. And so that really, kind of built that sets the stage for what I think hemp is, where it's like we've got to take those pros that I just mentioned, which is like not there are not only business things that are helpful for business, right? Like I mentioned, burden from 280E taxes, all those things would be relieved. But also consumers would have access via traditional retail channels. Um, at least so far, there are no possession limits for hemp. I think possession limits are just an
Mm,
archaic concept that we made as a consolation for in legalization, and hemp
mm.
doesn't have that. I'm actually about to interview somebody that the cops took like 50 pounds, I think, of hemp from them, and they had to give it back because it was hemp.
Wow.
I
Oh,
mean, you
wow.
don't, and I mean, I'm sorry, but I think that's a win. That
Mm.
right there is like a story of a win because the person was selling weed that he was calling hemp, and the law enforcement officer had to give it back here in Illinois. And I guess to transition to the good and the bad, I think that starts it out. Hemp is the beginning of descheduled cannabis, and I was going to display
Mm.
my policy outline for this point by showing the end of the 2018 Farm Bill. Let me get that out of the way. If you go to the 2018 Farm Bill, and I'll just do it to show people. Oh, can I click on that link? Yeah. So here's the 2018 Farm Bill. If I scroll all the way to the bottom, because it's a really long document. The very end, it says conforming changes to the Controlled Substances Act. And it makes a distinction between tetrahydrocannabinol Schedule 1 and basically exempts hemp. So, except for tetrahydrocannabinols in hemp, in other words, they've descheduled part of the cannabis plant. They've created a new legal term, as we said earlier, marijuana, hemp, legal terms, cannabis, the botanical term. They have drawn a line and essentially descheduled cannabis. So that starts out with the good, right? We're all pushing for descheduled cannabis. And I've almost I've tried to reach out to some groups that are pushing for descheduled cannabis. And I've been wanting to ask, what's the difference between, descheduled cannabis and hemp, besides this 0.3% threshold, which we'll get to later, is how I see we could kind of expand and completely deschedule cannabis. But I feel like I've got on a tangent and kind of lost myself in your question. I know your question
Oh,
was,
well, the benefits.
yeah, the
Yeah, no, you answered
benefits.
it. And I think that's consistent from what I hear from a lot of people who say that they are, there it is, that
Yeah,
they are in favor of, especially in the South, they say they're in favor of keeping hemp exactly the way it is because they say it's equitable because they can access, banking and let fewer taxes and all these things that marijuana does not have.
yeah, exactly. And to go through, Texas is a good example of what you're just saying, and honestly, so if you think about it, everything that I'm displaying right now, which really answers your question, the key benefits of hemp policy as I see them. If you think about a state like Texas, they have all these things right now. Again, the attorney general or somebody just launched an attack on this, but they have descheduled and legal cannabis. And the companies that operate within that framework have access to the banking services, everything we talked about, but also just with regard to market access and consumer choice, which is something we haven't talked about really. We did talk about access in retail channels, which I think is a much more consumer friendly experience. By the way, delivery, very consumer friendly experience, and I got to give you credit. You led the way in Massachusetts. You got one of the first deliveries. But not many states have followed suit, unfortunately. And hemp has just kind of shown that, what was sort of funny about that delivery is hemp has, now that I think about that and I've brought that up, I'm pretty sure the person that delivered to you had like a body cam on and stuff. And am I
Oh
wrong?
God, yeah, don't get me started on those regulations. Yep,
And I get it. It's just the hemp has shown basically some of those silly regulations are not necessary. We're
that's
just getting it
true.
delivered by the UPS man.
Right,
And
with no limit on how much. Yep. And so when you talk about Texas, all of this is just from the Farm Bill, right? There's no
Correct.
special law allowing it in Texas. Okay.
Except for in Dallas. So the advocates we spoke to in Dallas, so not only did they decriminalize 3 ounces, but they made it so that the police are not allowed to determine whether something is legally marijuana or hemp. In other words, all cannabis is legal in Dallas. So pretty cool.
That's very interesting.
This is a big one though to wrap up your question.
Hmm.
The idea of having an open and competitive market. There's no, and this is one you helped me to formulate before I even in my head before I even actually made this document. No license moratoriums. I am supportive, and this is in our recommendations of ownership caps. But as we were kind of talking about earlier, it should be like a fishing license. Go and buy it. Allow the competition and innovation to take course. This is a big one, and we've sort of touched on it, but consumers benefit from no purchase or possession limit, which increases freedom of choice. I just think it is silly sometimes. Like I remember my first experience going to Denver, Colorado, and I was like, I want that, I want that, I want some of those cookies, and they're like, whoa, 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 dude, your first choice. You're already over your purchase limit. You can't.
Really?
Yeah, because I was like, I want an ounce of that, I want some,
Uh,
and they're like, whoa, and I was like, wait a minute, I thought this was a store, and they're like, and I was like, can I come back in? And they're like, technically no. At the time, they're like, technically no, but yeah. Um,
you go back to the end of the line and come back. Yeah.
right. What is now called looping, and they do not allow in
That
Colorado
changed.
anymore.
Right.
At least at least
You
when they
may or may
can
not
prevent
be
it.
able to do it in Massachusetts.
Right. Well, what's funny is in Michigan, um, a lot of consumers from Illinois to Ohio, Indiana, they all go to Michigan. I call it marijuana Mecca, and jokingly. And on the way there, you'll see billboards in Indiana that say you can buy as much as you want. They'll let you do that in Michigan. It's kind of interesting. So I bring that up.
Whoa. The
Yeah,
the billboards in Indiana say that about Michigan. Oh, that's
correct.
so interesting.
Right? Isn't that weird? In a non-legal state, you're like, yeah, I can go buy as much as I want. But I bring that up because sometimes people, just like with anything else in cannabis, it seems it's become a purity test. And because I've voiced any support at all for hemp, people think I'm anti marijuana. In other words, anti legal cannabis. It's
Oh,
like, no,
weird.
I cheerlead legal cannabis when they do it right. And Michigan, as I've said a few times in this episode, is doing it right in some regards, and this is one of them. So it's like, to get back to your question, so we've covered the good. Um, we'll get to the bad, but it's like I think we should take these good things and implement them in our cannabis systems, you know, um,
Yeah, that's a great
because they're
analogy,
good.
especially yeah, the comparison to medical marijuana too. I had never heard that before because
Yeah,
they're so often hemp and marijuana are so often seen as competing, but really it's a one could be an incremental path to the other.
yeah. So, and we can talk about the bad, but I think the biggest talking point that I've heard, for some reason, I engage with cannabis stock investors. I don't know why. But one of the things that they've literally told me is like, they've told me off record is like, Cole, I buy hemp myself because I live in a. Actually, some of them even told me on record, Cole, I'm anti-hemp, but I buy hemp because I'm from Georgia and I don't have access to any cannabis products. It's like, oh, okay, I see how it is. But literally, some of these cannabis stock investors have told me, Cole, I'm only opposed to hemp because it challenges my investment thesis. In other words,
Yeah,
cannabis,
my event investment.
yeah,
That's why I'm
cannabis,
off Twitter. That phrase is a wonderful representation of why.
right? Right. In other words, this brick and mortar model that basically every legal cannabis system is created, where you've got cultivation centers and dispensaries. They see cannabis being sold through retail channels and online and everything else as direct competition to their
Sure.
investment,
Mhm.
you
Unless
know?
it's owned by the same companies, right?
Right. As soon as the companies they start investing in, of which many are, jump over into hemp, all of a sudden hemp is a great thing. Yeah.
Hmm.
So like Curely, for example, they're geniuses. Nobody ever thought about doing hemp like that before, even though we've been talking about it on the show for about 2 fucking years. Um, anyways,
And how's it going for them? Like, is it tough for them to have competition all of a sudden?
That's why I found most remarkable, and that's why I've sent it to you and I've shared it with others. Like people are like, "Oh, of course, Curaleaf or GTI is getting in it. They're just opportunists and they're gonna, get in anything they can." And I'm like, I agree with all those things, but also these companies have typically like the way they pitch themselves to investors is they say, and actually this is from the mini doc and it's from a report that you were included in from Breaking Points. Trying to think who was
Matt
the
Stoller.
Matt Stiller, thank you. Um, he included some of the documents that actually Curaleaf and GTI use. They say we only invest in limited participant markets, something to that effect. In other
Hmm.
words, that's why I found it shocking because yes, hemp is seemingly everything they avoid. They don't go to Oklahoma. They got out of California because at a time it was too crazy. They don't participate in Oregon. So to see them get involved in hemp, I was like, is the cat out of the bag? Are they realizing that limiting competition is a failed, you know, approach?
Hmm.
So I don't know. I don't know if they're doing well or not, but I find it notable that people that tend to shy away from natural market forces are leaning into them, you know?
I find it notable too. By the way, do you like when I ask you questions that I've already asked you in real life and pretend like I'm asking them for the first time?
I didn't even actually notice. Maybe we talk a lot, so maybe I didn't realize you'd
That was
answer.
me trying to be an interviewer.
Gotcha. Gotcha.
Do you want to move on to what are the negative parts of hemp
Yeah.
pills?
Yeah, absolutely. And I can display that as well because I've got that pulled up. There are definitely a fair few recommendations that I have on how we could make hemp better. Again, this is what we're discussing is taking the best and leaving the rest. That's what I've come up with as a little catchy saying for this. And first and foremost, a lot of these actually are inspired by you, Shaleen, and you
I
know
can see it. I love to see it.
the papers that you've written and the ideas you've instilled in myself. And, to start, I think that we should establish ownership limits. And you'll notice I don't prescribe what they should be because I'm not sure, and some people have shown me some nuance in like what ownership limits were. But the idea is to implement ownership caps, which would prevent market consolidation and foster a more competitive and diverse marketplace. The real idea is to make sure that no one player has a bigger footprint than another, right?
Hmm.
Um,
Well, you
so
could have a bigger footprint, but you just can't cross a certain threshold.
there you go. Yeah, there will be big operators to your point. But yeah, there will be limits to that as well. And I think that is something that hemp is lacking. And that's why when we started this conversation, I said, on one hand, it's probably the best thing, but on the other hand, it's really scary because of these first two proposals that I lay out, or recommendations rather, that I lay out. Um, Limiting vertical integration, which is actually something I wanted to discuss with you. I think we should set restrictions on vertical integration to ensure a level playing field and encourage fair competition among businesses of varying sizes. I almost rephrased this one because of, just recent conversations I've had, and I wanted to flip this over to you for your thoughts. I recently heard a report in Cranes, Chicago. John Pletz was saying that the smallest operators he's spoken to in Illinois, they found the only way they could survive and compete is if they did vertically integrate. I've heard the same thing from the small operators I choose to shop with in Michigan because I don't go for the corporate cannabis in Michigan either. I look for the small time operators and I always ask them, like, how are you able to compete with some of these people that are just slashing prices? And they're like, we grow our own and we bring it here and we insulate ourselves to a certain degree. I
Mhm.
mean, you can't totally, but using vertical integration. So I'm curious because I actually took this proposal from you. What are your thoughts on this? One of the things you mentioned is like maybe keeping it to small business?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So first, if you're listening and you're hearing this for the first time and you're interested in these things, these first you can find more about them in this paper I wrote called "Bigger is Not Better: Preventing Monopolies in the Cannabis Industry." It was the #2 paper in the world on antitrust in 2022 on SSRN. Yeah, right here where you can find it for free. And the goal was to present the problem and those lines you mentioned earlier about GTI and Curaleaf from the Breaking Points interview, those are in this paper, along with the problems that could happen with alcohol and tobacco, and then some recommendations to keep it from happening. And if you read this and you like it, whether it's for hemp or anything else, please take these ideas, adopt them. You don't need to credit me. The whole point was to put them out there for people to transform and to come up with riffs on them to make them better, which is what you just did, Cole. I absolutely agree. So one thing that we could do that's quite common in other industries is to prohibit vertical integration because we don't want to have gigantic companies dominating every level of any industry, but making an exception for if you're small, because if you're by definition not dominating, the whole point can be that you get a different advantage and you're able to use that. So for an example, the federal bill called the SHIP Act would allow direct to consumer access just for small cannabis businesses, which is a form of vertical integration because you're the cultivation and you're the retailer when you're shipping to the consumer. And that would be a great thing, I think, for small cultivators who then wouldn't have to, they could skip this whole process, small batch, people who don't want to grow past a certain size. You could also have a tasting room in a dispensary for certain small businesses where you don't want to go get a whole social consumption license, but it's on a small enough scale where you can have social consumption, retail, and perhaps even cultivation in one area from the same company. So I think that's a really great example, and it could be done with hemp as well. And you can really play with any of these recommendations so that you're preventing the domination of a market, but also allowing for the kind of flexibility that people want to see. And one other thing on the ownership limits, uh, I think you mentioned or alluded to the fact that there are questions about what exactly they should be. I think in Massachusetts, it just happens that what we tried on the first try, which was 3 licenses of each type for marijuana, turned out to be just right. But you could also write into a bill, if you're doing this for hemp federally, for example, you can just write into the bill that no one can dominate an industry, and then you can leave it up to the agency, any implementing regulating agency, to determine what that limit would be. So you don't have to come up with it beforehand.
I love that. And yeah, that's, I think, where I got caught. That's when I said somebody poked holes in my example I used. It's because I used it in Illinois. I said, we've got 3 cultivation center limit, 10 dispensary limit. And the person was like, well, what if you have like, yeah, he like basically listed different license types that I wasn't even considering. And so I think that I actually didn't know that Massachusetts is just like, look, 3 of any license type. That's kind of, I like that it's agnostic, because I think my specific example is why there were able to be, sort of questions asked like that. Um, so yeah, it's an interesting one. I will say before we just move on, one of the things that I always, and we've talked about this in the past, I always like covet this, the establishing ownership limits. At least in Illinois, like a lot of the ownership data is under lock and key, which sucks
Mhm.
because we have to basically, not that I don't trust our regulators, but we just have to trust them, whoever they are at any given time, right? And I just wish that it was something that was a little bit more public because, even David Lakeman has told me that regulators rely on folks like myself that watch all these things,
100%. Mhm.
and so I just think that, I guess what I'm trying to say and what I was trying to covet is putting Illinois aside, the fact that we have ours under lock and key. Like, I also wanted to just acknowledge, and I'm curious if you've thought about this, like, it seems like this could be a hard thing to enforce because of the nature of like how shell games work
Oh
in the
yeah, you
United
have to
States.
invest just as much into this as like your consumer safety standards.
Right.
But we did that here. You have to, I mean, there's different ways you can do it, but we contracted with a accounting firm that did forensic accounting and looked into the contracts. And the thing is, though, if you do that enough in the beginning, when you're willing to like take tips and like you said, from people like yourself or, former workers or whomever, and you're willing to like, I hate to use the law enforcement term, but like make an example, and just like provide that as a deterrent. Like if you do this, it's not going to go well for you and you're gonna have to pay hefty fines. You may not get a license, it may be voided, etc. Then I think that can help make the investment you put into it more reasonable.
Yeah. Yeah, well, to just breeze through these next ones, and I don't mean to say breeze because this is an important one. Strengthen corporate accountability, another one that I want to credit you for. It's something I see all the time now when I go to the stores. I see the big Philip Morris warnings. It's something
Mhm.
whenever I see it, I think of you as well, because I never noticed that the warnings that are mandated to be posted in stores. That's not necessarily what this recommendation is specifically about, but it's just something that you've put on my radar. The idea of, having protections against corporations with histories of public fraud, corporate crimes, or significant health impacts. You want to talk a little bit more about this? I know we've talked about it in the past, but again, I kind of stole it from you, so I feel like you might be able to say it better than I just did.
Um, Yeah, I mean, there are companies that we know for sure have lied about their products intentionally and harmed people. It's resulted in thousands of deaths with tobacco companies in particular. But there are also so many other companies that have, yeah, histories of public fraud, corporate crimes, or significant health impacts. I love how you put that. And very simple, those people should not be allowed to sell cannabis or hemp.
Yeah, yeah. And this next one is kind of back to, again, it's just in the spirit of some of the problems that I believe exist. Um, we should enhance the testing standards for cannabis. I'm referring to both hemp and marijuana, those legal terms, beyond Delta 9 THC levels. Now, oftentimes, state legal marijuana is tested beyond Delta 9 THC levels, but oftentimes, hemp, I shouldn't say oftentimes, but it's only required that hemp
Hmm.
is tested for that Delta 9 THC percentage, which is why a lot of people say it's unregulated, it's untested. No, it's tested just for one cannabinoid.
Yeah, and the
you
kind
know?
of random one. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
relative to safety. Yeah, that's a really good one.
yeah. And I think this is a lesson that could be taken for both hemp and cannabis. Again, because we should expand testing to support more comprehensive quality assurance, product safety, and consistency. One of the things I talked about with a expert in cultivation is that, cannabis products, the end product is just tested. In many other consumable industries, there's testing throughout. Like there's air quality testing in the facility that it's being
Mm,
produced in. That doesn't
yeah,
happen in cannabis.
yeah, that's a great point.
Things like that. So, and this leads us to the next point, which we've kind of already covered, but we need to improve testing and integrity across markets. And again, this is for both hemp and cannabis. Um, it seems like instituting oversight by reference laboratories as a standard practice for all state regulated markets could address these issues. And that's what we're seeing right now with, I think Massachusetts is starting one, Illinois is starting one. Several different states are in the processes of starting one. I believe Illinois is, at least from what David Lakeman has said, is leading the charge. We're the closest to getting ours opened. Um, so yeah, I think those are all recommendations which address, I think, some of the real negative issues that may exist with hemp.
I think that's really good.
And I guess to put it another way, the hemp industry's regulatory advantages have fostered accessibility, yet critics argue that this unregulated environment has also enabled the sale of poorly manufactured and potentially harmful cannabinoid products, some possibly synthetic, to uninformed consumers, including minors. Some claim this has led to a public health crisis, caused economic distress for the legal cannabis market, and though these concerns may blend real issues with red herrings, I think exploring responsible solutions can help us ensure safe consumer access and protect our market integrity. So, a lot of what I've been, this entire paper was based around is an individual I've had on the show in the past, Rod Kite. He's an attorney that does both cannabis and hemp. What's funny is I say cannabis and hemp. Again, marijuana and hemp. I just hate using the word marijuana, so that's I always feel weird.
Why?
Um, what's funny is Jordan Davidson asked me that same question. I said because of its roots in racism, and that's what I thought. And then he like brought out this article which was like, no, this guy says that it's not that way, and this was a big talking point. And um I had somebody on the show that was better able to explain it to me, that like two things can be true at once type of thing.
Yeah,
Like the word could have also been used culturally, but it also was used in as a racist term, to kind of make it sound scarier.
right.
So, admittedly, just off the hip, I feel uncomfortable using the word because I prefer the botanical term,
Hmm.
you know. But I'm a little bit unclear as to like the history on for me though, it's always been taught to me that marijuana is like was made up as kind of like a white man came up with it to basically like slander and make it sound scary, you know?
Well, I would say misused rather than like came up with it. I'm kind of agnostic on it, but I've been lately getting annoyed. This is, of course, not directed at you, by
Oh
some
yeah.
people who feel like that's the extent of like fighting for racial equity is
Right,
like
right.
using the
That's
word
all you need to
cannabis
do.
instead of marijuana. Yeah, it's been a pet peeve of mine. But I was just curious. I want to hear about what Rod Kite said.
Oh yeah. Yeah. So anyways, I feel weird about not using the botanical term. But anyways, he represents people in both industries and he's come up with this three-pillar approach, which we've kind of discussed, but this is really boiled down. Age gating. This addresses the concerns that these people are hunting down our children, right? As the representative said. I say that a little bit tongue in cheek. We should apply age restrictions to ensure minors do not access these products, and we should align that with our public safety standards for other products like these. Um, Admittedly, I think there's a little bit of nuance here. Epidiolex is pretty useful for children, but I think parents are often involved in that decision.
Mhm.
So I don't know.
And there is
Just
an existing framework for that.
correct.
Medical hemp could be just the same as medical cannabis.
Right. Right. So quality controls for safety, requiring adherence to GMP standards to guarantee product safety and consistency. And we should address the synthetic cannabinoid concern by focusing on regulated, safe production. In other words, any chemicals or solvents that are not already being used in the cannabis industry should probably not be used with hemp either. And that's another thing that I don't know that we've exactly touched on, but there's not a lot of research, and I've got this on my paper here somewhere. Yeah, the pervasive lack of cannabinoid research affects both industries, and it's a concerning gap, but it's never served as a valid justification for banning these products. That's just the cannabinoid research, though. I want to be clear that you have a very valid concern, and other people have. I share the concern of chemicals being used. And I brought up Adam Terry earlier. I think I got lost. What he had explained was that when you do these conversions, there are downstream conversions that occur that are
Mm.
beyond sometimes even our scientific understanding. So
I've heard
that's
him
what,
say that too. Yeah, 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 yeah.
yeah, so
Mm.
that's why I think this is a real thing we should try to address. And this, any other thoughts on that before I move to the last one? I was just trying to breeze through to close out our policy outline.
No, keep going.
Cool. I really like this last one because it addresses other concerns that people have. We should have transparent labeling for consumer
Mhm.
information. We should ensure products are labeled with clear ingredient and concentration details, along with potential side effects like impairment or drug test outcomes. Um, I also think, and this is a part of a proposal that was recently introduced, and I've sort of mentioned it a few times, that if it's found that that labeling is not accurate, you should be subject to the same um, repercussions or I'm looking for the word
Penalties?
penalties, thank you, as any other product that you mislabel. Again, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act has protections against mislabeled products already, from what I understand. And am I saying that this should all fall under FDA? No, but I think we should. I'm not necessarily saying that, but I think we could
You can
take a
take the good and leave the
page.
bad from the FDCA. Absolutely.
Yeah, and this last one is super huge. I'm curious what you think about this. I think it would freak somebody out like Jordan Davidson, but I really believe we need to do away with hard potency caps, like legislated potency caps. I think informed consumers should have the choice to choose their product strength, just like we are when we go to the liquor store. You know, you can purchase Everclear or you can purchase a beer. And I mean, I've never really had to explain the difference between Everclear and a beer to like an adult before. Like people, I don't know if it's through culture
Yeah.
or what, but we know. And if you
Mhm.
don't, sometimes you learn, and hopefully it's not the hard way. And by that I mean sometimes the way people have learned drugs like alcohol is through their college days and pushing it a little too hard. And you're like, whoa, it's not how we should use that drug. Right. And so I think that adults should have the ability to make those decisions like we do with other products. I'm curious what you think about this because I actually do have a slight concern with this proposal, but I want to give you some space in case you have any ideas.
Well, with hemp, I completely agree because I mean, what would you even have caps on, right? Just like a random assortment of like ever-changing cannabinoids.
Well, what
They
I
would be
mean,
arbitrary almost by definition, right?
yeah, yeah. I mean, what I mean is what I'm referring to is like in Illinois, you can only get 100 milligrams max in an edible, which I realize for some people is a lot
Wait, of what though?
of THC. Sorry. Thank you.
Okay. So I feel like they're different things. So if for hemp, I think it would be arbitrary. For cannabis, for marijuana and THC, I mean, I agree with not having arbitrary potency caps, but that's not a fair argument against potency caps in general because the whole scenario that you outlined about alcohol, it just doesn't apply to marijuana because people don't have that inherent cultural understanding. And you don't have a static market. It seems like um, the potency and the products are changing constantly. And so again, like we did a study here with the commission's research department, and they determined that there is no potency limit that makes sense and that it would be arbitrary, and therefore we shouldn't implement one. And I agreed with that, and we went with it. But still, that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be one at all. I think that like there's a lot of harm being caused by potency that's going up and up, and consumers that are only focused on a THC percentage. And that's something I've evolved on a bit because I didn't worry about it so much in the beginning because I thought that if there was so much THC in a product or if a product was so potent as to be uncomfortable that people would just choose not to use it. Like that's what I had always experienced personally. But that doesn't seem to be the way that it's going.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, that was my only like concern, if you will, here. I still wonder, like you said, to your point of there not being the cultural understanding. It's like, how do we get it if we don't just, I know this sounds crazy, but let it rip, you know?
Well, but because I think you might have conflated like how much THC can be in a package, right? So that's the same as like how much alcohol can be in a drink, right? So that
Hmm.
should be standardized. And I'll stand by the 5 grams per serving in Massachusetts until I die, even though so many people say it should be 10 or more. But that's a separate thing from potency, which is usually expressed as a percentage.
Yeah, I think you're right. Thank you for clarifying that. So hold on, are you saying that like you would not be supportive of like a product like this because it's 50 milligrams in one can?
Yeah, I am saying that. Unless is it a medical product?
No, it's a hemp. Well, this one's a hemp product, but to your point, I get what you're saying. So are you saying you'd be open to that? Like if it was a medical product like that, that would
Yes.
be
So basically, I think if you are over 21 and you walk into a store and you buy a can of soda, you're going to expect to just drink that can of soda.
fair.
And so I think that if it's going to have 50 milligrams in it, you should just have to get a medical card first.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Do you think, and I'm just this point just has me really curious. So do you think that it could be addressed through like public health, like um public education, or even I've seen like speaking of Cantrip, they just sent me their cans and they make it specific, like 5 milligrams is your specific dosing, and they even have like lines down the can how much you should pour out to like help somebody, not drink the whole can like you just said.
Yeah, theoretically, yes. I think it could be addressed by a whole series of public health measures, including like labeling and like packaging, like you said, and just time, people understanding the product over a number of years. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Because, like, you're bringing up a really real issue. Like, so for example, I got these gummies from Michigan recently, 4 gummies, 200 milligrams for the whole package. And it said something like one gummy, since it's 50 milligrams, it was 10 servings per, because they were cutting it up into, they expected me to like cut it up into five. Of course, I ate the whole package because wild side, right?
It's a
But
normal thing to do. You expect to eat a whole package of gummies. Yeah.
also, I did it because I knew what I was signing up for. But to your point, somebody who doesn't and then does that and doesn't read, oh my God, one gummy had like 10 times the normal starting. Like, I get where you're coming from on that. I just wish we could figure out how to leave room for somebody like myself who is like knowledgeable and is like, I know what I'm signing up for and I'm ready to go to the moon, you know?
Yeah.
Because the only reason I say this is because it seems like one of the big arguments about hemp right now is like some of the people are coming around and they're like, all right, like these stock investors, some of these people that I watch that do the cannabis investment shows, they're like, okay, hemp can stay, but only low dose in the retail stores. And I'm like, but I like buying a 50 milligram can. Why do I have to go to the dispensary for it? And I guess what the reason I'm even passionate about it is it feels like, so I want to be clear, I get your point. But when they talk about it, the way they say it, and people that kind of fight for low dose, it makes it feel like cannabis is so dangerous that it must be regulated to low doses. And it's like, no, 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 we always agreed. Like, yeah, maybe you shouldn't eat 200 milligrams, but you're not gonna die. You're just gonna have a crazy story.
I don't like the "you're not gonna die" argument. Like, I don't feel like nobody has ever died is effective because I don't want, whatever. I don't want somebody to go to an emergency room. I don't want them to have a horrible experience. And for me, a medical card just makes sense as the gate because it already exists. But there's all kinds of like gates that they could have it behind the counter. You could have to like maybe sign a statement of like, I understand how much THC is in this product, anything like that. I just think that in general, it would be irresponsible. This is the regulator in me, obviously, not the consumer that would say it would be irresponsible to just put that on a shelf and let people buy it because they're going to think that one serving of food equals one average serving. Now,
Yeah.
the consumer in me thinks that we should have more low dose products available just for market reasons, because I think a lot of people would just prefer to buy low doses and they can't find it. But I assume the market is going to solve that at some point.
Yeah, you'd hope so. That's another thing that you've mentioned, that I have several other friends that have smoked their whole life. They're like, dude, the weed is just, I can't even smoke a joint anymore, just like casually. Cause like a couple puffs in, I'm fucking gone,
Yeah, and
type of
not
thing.
everybody wants to feel that way.
Yeah, not everybody wants to feel that way. So cool. I didn't mean to extend. I had said 15 more minutes, and here we are an hour later. I didn't mean to extend that too much, but that is one topic that I definitely am interested in, and I liked your closing proposal on that, which is like, okay, maybe it's not a can and a cooler. Like, yeah, like you said, if I buy this can in a cooler and you're like, it's got THC in it, I'm just going to drink the whole can. And if I wasn't knowledgeable like I am, that could be a messy situation. But maybe maybe like we do with, I don't know that all stores do this, but I've seen some stores where the concentrated alcohol, like you say, is literally in a cabinet. Like you have to ask somebody to come and get it for you. And are you thinking like something like that might be like, so it's at
Yeah.
least you know like what you're getting into.
Yeah, it's all about knowing what you're getting into. Exactly. Yep. Yep. You said it. Is
Cool.
there anything else on the hemp outline that you didn't say?
You know, not really. There's just like the closing word, which is just basically saying that we could probably adopt, sorry, I say by adopting the positive aspects of hemp policy, such as descheduling, market accessibility, and consumer focused regulations, while addressing legitimate concerns with the practical solutions, the cannabis industry can build a sustainable and progressive future. Again, taking the best, leaving the rest. So that's, I think, it on the policy outline.
Can I give you a compliment?
Yeah.
I go out of my way to not talk about hemp because I have no expertise on it, but like I read enough obviously to just, maintain some knowledge and I was playing dumb a little bit because I'm trying to practice being an interviewer. But reading this outline, I really think this is one of the best, most straightforward frameworks that I've seen. And I think if people are feeling confused about hemp policy, which most people are these days, it would be a good idea to read this outline. Also, I just watched a documentary, and you have a really broad set of skills because the documentary is so entertaining and it goes by so fast, and it's like all these different like modes of communication. And this is such a like straightforward academic text outline, and you did both really well.
Thank you. It's hard to switch gears, and I've admittedly in both elements felt a little out of place because, like, as you've experienced with this podcast, I'm pretty long-winded and sometimes all over the place. And so, like, when people asked me what was wrong with Illinois cannabis legalization, I would always give a different answer. And like
Mhm.
sometimes I'd be like, "Yeah, I killed it. They got it." And sometimes I'd be like, "Man, but I should have mentioned that." And oh, what about this? And so my mini doc was my way of something I can point to that I feel gives you that stump speech and as short as I could. And I know it's an hour, but when you look at a conversation like we had today or other podcasts, it's always been hard to tell people where to start with my content, because we get so into the weeds. So I really feel like the mini doc is going to be helpful, not only for people trying to get involved in cannabis policy in general, but to get into this show. Um, and like a last thought on it, and I just wanted to say thank you, by the way. That really means a lot. Like
Yeah,
seriously.
you
The
bet. I'm going to
last
assign it in my class also.
really that
Yeah.
thank you. That really means a lot to me. I just the other thing I hope people see, because some people have commented on it, they're like, well, Colorado has possession limits too. Did they fail? And or Ohio has some of these problems too. Did they fail? And it's like, I want to quote Representative Ammons. It's not that anybody failed. We appreciate the progress that has been made. We just don't feel that enough has been done to ensure equity and justice. And that's really what this issue was supposed to be about. And so yeah, I tried to put that into a bottle because I feel like it's easy to get lost in that, you know. So
Yeah.
I appreciate
Well
that
said.
compliment.
Yeah, yeah, it made the case really well, and it had like it was so concentrated because like every interview was down to like the one most powerful sentence, and then the whole thing was an hour, but it was like a really dense, powerful hour.
Yeah.
Yeah, people should watch it. If you hate YouTube like me and you never watch anything on YouTube and you're listening, like push yourself and watch it.
Yeah, hell yeah. colememo.com/minidoc. And thank you also for the compliment on the one pager or three pager as I'm calling it, my policy outline, because when you were like asking me about it and you're like, just try to lay it out in like a one pager. I'm like, that's a fucking brilliant idea. I don't know why I haven't done that yet. So I feel like it's like in the similar spirit of what I did with the mini doc, where it's like you can ask me about hemp one day and then another day, and I'll give you different answers. With this policy outline, it's like here it all is, and um, Yeah, I just really appreciate that compliment, because somebody had recently asked me, like, Cole, why don't you put this into the hands of legislators? And I'm like, I didn't think about that, but maybe that could be helpful, because this issue is complicated, especially if you don't care about cannabis,
Mhm.
like, so
Yeah, and legislators usually just hear, obviously, they just hear like banking and taxes and, whatever the industry priorities are.
mhm.
So, I bet there's a lot of staffers that would watch this and come away pretty enlightened.
Right. And that's a good point, at least for me to close out that loop on, like, one of the things I recently went to Springfield and I was really happy that I did because each representative that I went in and spoke to, just like I told you with that Republican representative, even if they may not have agreed with me, what they appreciated most, and some of them admitted this to me, whenever they come in, they'd flip their notebook paper because some other lobbyist was walking out, some other business is walking out, and they're like, all right, who do you represent and what's your business?
Right.
And I'm like, oh, I'm Cole. I'm just here as a person in Springfield. And they like literally look up and they're like, what? Like,
You
and we
took them
just,
out of their days, yeah.
yeah. And you can see like the relief. It's not that obviously I had a reason to come to Springfield. So yes, I have things to talk about, but just the fact that I'm a person is like a huge relief to legislators in and of itself. And I guess what I'm saying in that is that I think sometimes too often regulators and legislators, all they hear from are the business people, like, oh, your regulations are making it hard for me to operate, or we need relief from this, or whatever. And it's like, it seems like so rare that consumer, just the person that purchases these products and loves these products actually is involved in the process, you know?
That's such a great point to end on. Yeah, just to like bring it full circle. And what I'm trying to do behind the scenes is just make sure people feel confident and educated. And, so often people are like, oh, I'm not a lobbyist and I'm not a lawyer. So, I'm not prepared for this meeting. And it's like, just like you described, that's the worst thing you could be. That's the most ordinary thing you could be. And the most
Yeah.
special thing you could be going into a meeting is just a normal person who cares.
Yeah. And, like David Lakeman said, they rely on, folks like us, maybe, that watch these things like a hawk. Legislators told me they rely on normal people to come in. They said that's sometimes how they get the best legislation, is if a normal person comes in and just says, this is how this affects me. Please keep this in mind, versus a lobbyist that's just simply trying to get something past the line.
I have regulations that are in place because someone tweeted them to me, just an ordinary
Wow.
person. And then I went into a meeting and I said it and then it passed and they're still in place now.
That I hope that's as inspirational for all of my listeners as that was for me. And like you said, I think that's a really good note to end on. I just wanted to thank you again for spending so much time with me today. I really hope that just because you're stepping away from your current position and kind of doing, like you say, the handoff, that this isn't the last time we podcast. So, um,
Yeah, anytime. It's super fun.
cool. Cool. Well, keep fighting the good fight, even if it's behind the scenes. And I'm really looking forward to the next time we can consume together. That's one thing I forgot to
Maybe Hash
mention.
Wednesday next year.
Maybe Hash Wednesday next year, but I just wanted to mention we met up in Denver, Colorado last year, and that was so cool because I didn't even expect you to be in town, and met the whole family, and super cool to like actually meet you after having spoken to you virtually over all these years. So,
Yeah, that was cool. Yeah, let's tentatively plan on Hash Wednesday.
yes, stay tuned for another Hash Wednesday,
Yeah,
folks.
hopefully your listeners will come as well. I assume it's open to the public.
Yeah. Oh, of course. It's got to be. Anyways, I hope you found as much value in this conversation as I did, listeners. We'll see you on the next episode of the Cole Memo. Take care.